The following presentation is brought to you without commercial interruption by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. When you can't make it out to Gettysburg, we want to bring Gettysburg to you, and we can only do that with more support from our listeners. So please, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, where you will find our premium content made exclusively for our patrons. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.
Okay. Are we ready, Matt? Okay. So I want to thank everybody for coming out today or tonight. I'm surprised by the nice turnout. So tonight's program is going to be a little bit about commercialism. I have an enormous amount of slides. So I'll probably go through the slides very quickly as we talk about different themes. So I kind of got it broken down into a few categories. But first I'm going to talk about some random stuff. And then I'm going to do, I decided instead of like trying to do everything, I originally was going to divide it into restaurants and motels and museums. And what I ended up deciding to do was I have a bunch of general stuff at the beginning, and then we're going to take a tour of Cemetery Hill to the Emmitsburg Road and out the Emmitsburg Road. So I'll talk about one area of the town and battlefield that's been commercialized over the years, and then tie it into a whole bunch of different topics from there. The first thing I wanted to mention was the fact that, commercialism is not a bad thing. And I think over the years there's been a propensity to discuss commercialism in Gettysburg as if it's always bad, as someone is always taking advantage of tourists, or it's unnecessary evil. And the fact of the matter is, as we discussed a couple weeks ago when I did early battlefield preservation, is the fact that you have to have a place to stay if you want people to spend the night. And you have to have places to eat if you want to have a mass number of tourists visit your town. So commercialism goes hand in hand with the memorialization aspect of the battlefield. But, commercialization seemed to get a little bit out of control in the 1960s. And I think that, today people wander around the battlefield and they think that, that it's really commercial. Well, not the way it used to be. In the 60s, it was, as we'll see, there's some really a huge amount of commercialism, and there's really a lot of different things to talk about. Now, I did want to mention to start off that this year, 2022, if you do some math, is the 50th anniversary of the Farnsworth House restaurant. So 50 years. And, looking at it from a historian's perspective, businesses do not last for 50 years in the town of Gettysburg. So it's an amazing accomplishment. As a matter of fact, let's throw this out there. What is the oldest continuous operational restaurant in the town?
Jenny Wade.
Oh, you thought I was going there, but restaurant.
Oh, restaurant.
Dobbin House. No, the Dobbin House is not even as old as this. The Dobbin House, remember, is
70s.
Yeah, it started in 80. I think it opened in 80. Maybe she bought it in 79.
Yeah.
So.
About the Pike.
The Pike, good. Now, see, that one doesn't count because that was the Stonehenge, and then it was Big Boppers, and now it's the Pike, and there's different owners. So, one family, 100 years.
What?
Ernie's.
Oh, wow.
Ernie's hot dog. How about that for useless trivia? So it was wrote by his father, and then his grandfather before him. Okay. Now, here's an early photograph of the Farnsworth House. You see without the beer garden. And I don't know if you look behind the building in the trees. Do you see that there wasn't a back extension? Where the kitchen is. The kitchen was a little bit farther back, and that's a long story. Here's another older image of the Farnsworth House. It's one of my postcards. So throughout this show, we are going to discuss, we're going to see my brochure collection and my postcard collection. And believe it or not, since I first came here in the late 1960s, I've been collecting tourism brochures and postcards. And I have a huge collection of tourist brochures from all the area's attractions throughout the years. And they're at the Adams County Historical Society today. But here's two early brochures for the Farnsworth House. Not early ones, but different years. I like how the Farnsworth House ties, Jenny Wade and, one of the brochures years ago had like a whole story of the history of the area on it, which I thought was fascinating. Oh, and also, I hope that as I go through the show that, you'll do a little bit of reminiscing with me about the different attractions in town and things that you remember and things that you did. Because, I took photographs, throughout my time here, like a lot of people, and I have photographs. And this is me in the middle there with Charlie Fennell and Dave Richards and Jim Klaus and a couple others. And we're sitting right back there. You might see that cutout in the where the print is, where there was a fan, and the cutout's still up there in the back wall. So here we are in the Farnsworth House. I'm going to guess it's like 1990, something like that.
Which one's Charlie?
Charlie Fennell?
Yeah.
Does he look that much different? He's looks like he's kind of sitting in my lap. He's right beside me there. I think he snuck into the picture in a white shirt.
I can see it.
Yeah. He's saying that because Charlie, he has gray hair and he's raggedy and yeah. So to talk about some of the aspects of commercialism, I thought I'd use the example of Lee's headquarters. So you mentioned, Matt already mentioned it, the Jenny Wade House is the longest continuously operational museum in the town. Lee's headquarters was number 2, when it had been a gift shop open to the public from like 1921 until 2000, whenever it closed, 2010, I don't even know. So off the top of my head, maybe it was 2016, something like that. It closed. And early on, Lee's headquarters was a place you could go and buy gifts, and we have lots of souvenirs from the early history of Lee's headquarters. But like many early gift shops, it was free. You see under Lee's museum it says free, and the Jenny Wade House was free until the 1960s. So a lot of these museums, they got you in there, and then they sold you stuff. That's how they made their money, on the gifts. And the Jenny Wade House really perfected the gift shop early in our town's history. But the Lee's headquarters was opened up as a museum and a campground. And one slide I really wanted to put in the show was the Lee's headquarters campground with the cabins. And I don't really have a good image of that here in the show. But Clyde Daly owned Lee's headquarters. And he was actually put on display a collection. It was his father-in-law's collection, who owned a store in Gettysburg called Trimmer's Five and Dime. And he had a large collection of relics, and he put them on display up there. And for many years, of course, Lee's headquarters was a place you could visit and see the relics associated with it. You probably know that. I'll talk about that in a moment. I'll hold that thought. When we restored Lee's headquarters, there was a mound around it that the cannons sit up on in this photograph. And we actually tore that mound away around from the base of the photograph. But here's an image of Lee's headquarters from the 1950s, and on the right, you see a white house. Clyde Daly owned Lee's headquarters, and he owned the land west of it. And a family named Larson, Eric Larson and his wife, purchased a house here in the 1940s. It was the Dustman House at the time of the battle. And he turned it into a tourist house, and they opened it up to accommodate tourists. And eventually, they built little cabins nearby. And here you can see it says on it, Larson's Cottages. And you can see the cottages in the back there. We have some early postcards from that place. Here's the Cottage Court, Larson's Ridge House Tourist Cottages. And you see at the bottom they had the main house, which was a Civil War house, the Dustman House. rebuilt as their main facility, and then they had these little cabins. And I actually have a bunch of postcards from the Larson's Quality Inn because, Andy Larson was a good friend of mine. I kind of worked for him for a while. Now, what's interesting, in this Larson's Cottage Court, if you look at the bottom view, there's two houses on the right. When they got rid of these cottages, they sold them, and that one actually got rolled down the Mummersburg Road, and it's still there as somebody's house. It's just before you get to Belmont Road on the right-hand side. If I would have been energetic today, I could have rode out there and got a picture of it to show you. But that house still stands. Some of these cottages were repurposed by other people, and they're still around, which I think is fascinating. Of course, the Larson family ended up buying Clyde Daly's property. They got Lee's headquarters, and then they tore down the cottages and replaced them with buildings, motel buildings. And this was done in the 1950s. And you can see here one of Larson's buildings. So the business expanded over the years. Now, besides the Larsons having hotel buildings, and they didn't build them all at once. They built one, tore down some cottages, built another, tore down some more cottages, built another. I forget how many different units made up Larson's Quality Inn. But they also had a restaurant. And the restaurant early on was Dutch Pantry. And off the top of my head, I didn't look any of these facts up. I think it's like 1967 that the Dutch Pantry opened. I love their sign there, Dutch Pantry. And of course I have a brochure from Dutch Pantry, so you can kind of see inside the gift shop there. And what's interesting in this one, if you look on the top left, there's the 1858 Adams County wall map. And I think that's the first place I ever became aware of the historic, wall map of Adams County. I should also mention Andy Larson was an original member of the Adams County Historical Society when we started having membership in 1940. We found his membership card the other day to show to him. Andy Larson is still alive, and he's in his 90s. So his father, Eric Larson, is the one who started Larson's, that eventually became part of the Quality Inn. But when it was Lee's headquarters, that's the inside of it, still looked the same. So Dutch Pantry is kind of a chain, and then Dutch Pantry gave way to General Lee's Family Restaurant. And basically they changed the sign, they had kind of the same food, but I don't know how many people ate at General Lee's. That's what I remember it as when I first started coming to Gettysburg, General Lee's there. And have a menu from General Lee's. I don't know how many people have collected menus from all these different past restaurants in town. See, it's kind of mean when I do it, though, because I'm like, can I have one of your menus? Because then when you go out of business next year, I'll have a record of you. Now, I wanted to make this point, that in 1995, Andy Larson, maybe it was 94, approached me and said, hey, I'm getting older, I want to retire, I want to sell. Could you write a book about Lee's headquarters and the area around it and talk about how important it was? And then I wrote a manuscript, and then he handed it out to prospective buyers. And then after he sold it, then I published it into a little book called The Story of Lee's Headquarters. But Andy paid me to write that. And of course, the Monahans bought Lee's headquarters. And here's Pete Monahan, opened up a new restaurant at General Lee's headquarters called Muldoon's. Anybody remember Muldoon's? It didn't last very long. And then it became JD's Bar and Grill. Remember JD? He had a pub in the center of town called JD's Pub.
Yep.
But then I guess he and his wife split, and he went up and opened up JD's Grill, and then it became The Pub, and got JD's name away from that. I remember JD. He was a really interesting character. I think he was Italian, if I remember. But you can see JD took over from Muldoon. But JD didn't last very long, and then it was called the High Point on Seminary Ridge. Do you remember the High Point on Seminary Ridge? And then I was sending you. It was called something else for a while, I think. and then it became the Appalachian Brewery. I can't remember the name of the one in between. You have to think about that. But I'm not sure. And so people were really upset when they tore down the restaurant. But, two things about it. Larson's Quality Inn. First of all, Andy Larson, his entire life, wanted the National Park Service to purchase his property because he felt like they were dissing Lee's headquarters and he wanted to be part of the park. And he was, really pushing for the park to get the property and tear down the hotel. And then, of course, after the Monahans had it for many years, it became sort of a maintenance nightmare. This thing most of the buildings were over 50 years old. There was asbestos in the buildings. They wanted to renovate them. They really didn't have much option. So they went to Civil War Trust and asked Civil War Trust if they were interested in buying it. And then people complained about it. That evil Civil War Trust, tearing down, I don't even know what the issue was. Should we pass a law in our town that people can't sell their property to make money? Because that's what it really was. He wanted to sell it to somebody to buy it for a good amount of money. And as a hotel, it had run its course. But I think when you look at the series of commercialism in Gettysburg that has been that is now part of the Park Service, I think people tend to have a negative view of it, whereby if a business just runs it poorly and goes out of business, why don't we blame them for it? I don't know. These things bother me. How about the Peace Light Inn? So someone brought a placemat from the Peace Light Inn tonight. The Peace Light Inn burned. Oh, we'll talk about that. Burned in a fire. But it opened in 1941. The Warners owned it. And one of the interesting things is there used to be this tour book in the battlefield. You bought it at the visitor center and you drove around. It's written by Wilbur Nye and Edward Stackpole. And I remember taking the tour. And on the first day's battlefield tour, you're riding along and it says, "Oh, you're probably getting kind of hungry now. To the left is the Peace Light Inn. Why don't you stop by and get something to eat?" I'm like, "What? This isn't their tour?" And it said, if you ask Mr. Warner, he'll tell you about where they buried all the amputated arms and legs across the street from his hotel. If I would have found it, I would have put it in here. It's true that in the middle of the tour it said to do this. I thought they were very creative. In the brochure, let's get to the next one. Here, to give you an idea, if you don't know where the Peace Light Inn is, look to the right. In the background is the Peace Light. And on the left are the cabins. And we're almost at the end of Reynolds Avenue, getting ready to cross over the Mummersburg Road.
Were those the cabins at the top? Right?
Yeah. And in that other photograph, that was the cabins on the top right of it. So they had little tourist cabins. You like the tourist cabins? Isn't that kind of neat? Little tourist cabins.
Is that all battleground now, or whatever?
Yes, it's all part of the battlefield. So as I understand it, and I have not done the history of all these different properties, like I'd like to, because there's so many commercial properties in town. But I think the park negotiated a contract with the Warners. The park actually paid them for the property. But then there was a period of time where the Warners still ran the Peace Light Inn after they had been paid for it. And Mr. Warner was going to open up another restaurant, which I think he did, on Route 30 called The Inn. Somebody remember The Inn? But in this description of it, which is in the tourist magazine, Mrs. Warner is a descendant of Adams County's early settlers. And when you go to the Peace Light Inn, it features Mrs. Warner's chicken pies. As a matter of fact, one of the advertisements said the Battle of Gettysburg was fought because of Lee desiring Mrs. Warner's chicken pies. But in March 1979, it burned in a fire. After they had been paid for it, but prior to it being turned over to the park. Which I guess was fine with the park because the park was going to tear it down anyway. It was going to be restored to the way it
Maybe
was.
they collected the insurance money.
I have no idea. I know that in the newspaper article about it, Mr. Warner's really upset because his personal possessions got burned up in the fire. And so, and I personally didn't know the Warners. So, but it burned in the fire. Now, I don't know if I knew. I used to drive by it all the time. I never ate there. Lauren, did you have the chicken pie, Mrs. Warner's chicken pie?
No, never did.
Never did. I think I'd like to know more about that.
I knew John, I knew him, but I never had the chicken.
So here is the Shields Museum, which again, for me, it's near and dear to me because I would stop there and get a soda. It's on the first stage battlefield, and this was here from the 1920s. The building got torn down in the 80s. And it was Mr. Warner died in Mr. Shields, Ott Shields, Arthur Shields, born in Chambersburg. He was the conductor of the Gettysburg trolley for many years. And he owned cabins. You see the cabins behind Buford's statue? And Reynolds and Buford. You can see where the peace light is in the background. And we have lots of photographs of it. And again, it was a museum. When they closed down in the 1980s, they had an auction of all the stuff at the museum. And I remember they had a McPherson barn door with bullet holes in it. They went for a lot of money. But it was fascinating. I didn't buy anything, but I was there. And
It went for $3,200.
oh, you remember?
I didn't buy it. I bid.
You wanted it.
$20.
Now the park has got it now. It's up in the visitor center on display. So eventually it came back around to the park. But I know they didn't buy it there. And then I forgot exactly why I put this one in here. I have why am I putting Cleveland's Hotel on? Maybe this just got thrown in there. But Cleveland's Hotel was up the Harrisburg Road. And you might know, the Cleveland Hotel is abandoned at the moment. There may be people living in there. Maybe, I'm not sure, but it's falling apart. And here's my thing my point about this is, we have all these motels around town that were built, some in the 30s, some in the 40s. Many of them were built in the 1950s to take advantage of all the tourism that would come into Gettysburg during the 100th anniversary of the battle, which we're going to say is the golden age of tourism, the centennial of the Civil War. Now, these things now are all falling apart. And if you buy a hotel in town, like Civil War Trust bought Lee's headquarters, and you go to the borough, you can't tear that down. Harb. Made up of architects. Why is it the historian's responsibility to preserve cheaply built motels that were designed to take advantage of tourists in the 1960s? Why is that our responsibility? I want them all torn down. But Harb opposes the taking down of these tourist attractions. And a lot of times these things are built without permits. And
So they can never tear down Pickett stuff.
Good question. No, that's serious. That's a serious question. We'd be fought by the borough on it if we tried. Now, and boy, I don't know why this one got stuck in there. The Stockholm Motel is another hotel on the Harrisburg Road, and I guess my point here was that the Route 15 did not exist until the 60s and then the 70s, and then it was for a while it was one lane up until the 90s almost. Up until you got to up near Hunterstown Diner, Distelfink area, and the Stockholm Hotel, the Cleveland Hotel, and there was another hotel there, were along the Harrisburg Road. And to get to Gettysburg, you had to come down the Harrisburg Road from the north. Well, they put in a monorail 15, and all these hotels died. The Stockholm Motel is still there. What's it, 5 miles up the road? 3 miles north of Gettysburg. It's still there. And people are living in, it's like an apartment complex. So, if you know where that is. The college, and normally I would not go out of my way to say nice things about Gettysburg College, but the college, you got to give them credit. The college, has purchased over the years 4 of these motels I'm talking about. And they refurbished the hotels into dormitories for college students. What a great use of an old motel. Of course, I think maybe they should have torn them down and built dormitories. But, you know, this is easier in our town to do this. So here's the Travel Lodge. And you might notice on the left of the view, that's Carlisle Street. On the right, that's Lincoln Avenue, to give you an idea where it is. Now, I think it might be called Paxton Hall now.
That's Miser, okay? Paxton is across the street.
Yep, this is across the street, the old College Motel. And again, on our right is Carlisle Street south, and on the left is Lincoln. And then there's the old Criterion Motor Lodge. Do you know where that is? Like, it's across from Stevens Hall, but it's on Carlisle Street. And then, of course, we have I forgot about the restaurant. Do you remember the Lamp Post restaurant? Now, everybody who was in town at that time loves the Lamp Post. And let's see, unfortunately for me, Loring's here because I was going to say I'm the only one who's eaten at the Lamp Post, but I bet you Loring has eaten there many times.
Yeah, Tucky's doing that, right?
Tucky's.
When did it close down?
It's a dormitory for Gettysburg College.
Oh.
It's Carlisle Street, and on the left of the building is Stevens Street. And it does have it. I think it might be called the Lamp Post.
It is.
That's the name of the dormitory.
Yeah, that's a colonial, right?
And then the Colonial, which again is Gettysburg College dormitories. So, actually, don't you think that's pretty ingenious of them to turn all these motels into dormitories? Then the other thing I wanted to mention is bed and breakfast. Here's the Appleford Inn in the 1980s. And I remember the owner of the Appleford Inn at one time in a meeting, and I should tell you that in the 1990s, when I was an early tour guide, one of the tour guides who represented all the tour guides on the Travel Council, you know, I was friends with him, and no one else wanted to take it over, and he was retiring, so they put me on the board of the Travel Council in Gettysburg as a tour guide representative. So then I really got to see the inner workings of the tourist industry in Gettysburg with that job. And the lady at the Appleford Inn told me several times that she ran the first bed and breakfast ever opened in Gettysburg. And she kept saying that, and I'm like, why do you tell people that? You call something different, and you're doing the same thing, and you want us to acknowledge it somehow. That's the first bed and breakfast. How about the Rose Farm? When, you know, Joseph Weibel is having people spend the night, and he takes them on tours of the battlefield, and they eat breakfast and lunch at his house. Isn't that a bed and breakfast? How about the Blythe House, which is next door to the Appleford Inn? It was a tourist home in the 1920s. He didn't call it a bed and breakfast, he called it a tourist home. Yeah, first bed and breakfast. Here on Carlisle Street, that's another picture of the Blythe House, I'm sorry. Here's the Maple Lawn Inn, run by F. Mark Brain on Carlisle Street. And here's the Schwinn House, I think it is, the tourist home on East Lincoln. And the Wolf Home on East Lincoln. These aren't bed and breakfasts? I think this one says, look, at the very bottom it even says, breakfast if desired.
Well, it's different then.
That's for sale, Ken.
For
sale now.
That house?
Uh-huh.
We could make it back into a bed and breakfast.
There you go.
So now what I'd like to do is run across, I'm going to start at the cemetery, run down Baltimore Street, and then out the Emmitsburg Road and talk about some of the tourist attractions and some of the places around there. Now, this is not by any means meant to be comprehensive. So it's based upon my postcards, my photographs, my brochure collection, and then my ideas of what I think we should talk about. So first of all, Baltimore Street, and there's the Secularrama Building. Do you know in 1913, the Secularrama came to Gettysburg for the 50th anniversary of the battle. One of the copies of the Gettysburg Secularrama. And until the 1950s, it was in a building on Cemetery Hill where the tour center now is. So there's the old Secularrama Building. And then when it closed, then a few years later, the visitor center for the National Park Service was being built, and they obtained the Secularrama painting and then moved it out to what we refer to as the old Secularrama Building. But
Still standing?
this building, no. Oh, the old Secularrama building got torn. So this is, they all got torn down. Yeah. But here's a nice view of it. So it's a pretty big building, don't you think?
That's amazing.
If you know, and that's before almost all of our times, you know. So I don't have a memory of it. It got torn down before I was around. And then, of course, the building called the Gettysburg Tourist Center, got built. Now, I'd like to point out, you see the extensive porch there that's now closed in? This building was a temporary structure built to take advantage of tourists during the centennial of the Civil War, in the 1960s. And then that temporary structure just never got torn down. Do you know there's no plumbing in that building? Do you know there's no way that building goes up to code at the moment? Is that building going to be there? And is it our responsibility to preserve that building as historians?
Oh, yes.
It is over 50 years old. That's the only rule they have in Harb. If something's 50 years old. But I wanted to point out this because the tour center is, and I know a lot of the tour center people and the owner. How would you say that? I don't know if he's the owner, the guy who runs the tour center now. He's a really good guy. And they were very smart. Look at the tour bus. You like the early tour bus? And I have lots of brochures with the early tour bus. That is awesome. Wow. So they had a brochure.
I love it.
That's awesome.
So, and there was a tour tape in it. And I don't think the tour tape has changed much over the years. And of course, in the late 70s, early 80s, they got the double-decker tour buses. And they're very, very popular. But the tour center did something, and this was really Leroy Smith, if you knew him. He was the mastermind of this. They built a bunch of attractions around Gettysburg, and they convinced people that, hey, you come to Gettysburg, you stay in our hotel, you buy a ticket, and for one price, it gets you into all these attractions. Now, I may suggest that one of the things about it was they needed to build attractions so that people would be occupied in their tickets and felt like they're getting their money's worth. And he was the first one that started charging admission to the Jenny Wade House. So they had a bunch of attractions. And several times, as a tourist, I bought the ticket and went through all the attractions. And we're going to talk about some of them coming up on our thing. But very, very, very smart businessman, Leroy Smith. Should I mention that Leroy Smith died in a car accident? He pulled out of Marvelous Marv's parking lot and smashed into Dave's Photo at 50 miles an hour. It's across the street.
So was that the beginning of people running into buildings?
The very beginning of people running into buildings. Everybody see the paper this week?
Yeah.
Ride by the scene. That's all I got to say. Yeah, I'm sure Veronica will talk about this on your show.
We did on Friday.
Oh, okay.
Because I'll have to wait for the...
Okay. So, starting on Baltimore Street and working our way down, here's the Hall of Presidents. You like the Hall of Presidents?
Oh, yeah.
I loved the Hall of Presidents. I have to believe that I'm kind of in the minority with that, and my love for the Hall of Presidents maybe is not appreciated by everybody. But we have lots of early views. And look at some of their claims here. The Hall of Presidents exhibit, world's only complete collection of American presidents in wax. Have they not been to Disney World? Yeah. Or I'm sure there's other places. Look at the bottom. America's foremost historical education attraction. It might be a little over the top. But I loved the wax figures of the presidents. And I went in there a bunch of times as a kid. And here's my son. I made sure that now he can tell people he was in, the Hall of Presidents. Look how excited Sam is. And then, of course, I think one of my favorite museums in Gettysburg And you know, I should tell you this, because sometimes people think I'm making fun of the tourist industry. I love hokiness. And I think that everybody should be comfortable with a level of hokiism, is that a word?
Yes.
Hokiness in these attractions. And, you know, I told Tammy Myers one time at the Wax Museum, when they redid the Wax Museum and turned it into something else, you should embrace the hokiness. Take advantage of it. There's a lot of people that have fond memories of wax museums, and they don't look down on these kinds of attractions. Charlie Weaver was great. Of course, Charlie Weaver on Hollywood Squares, he was very famous, and before that on the Jack Parr Show. He was a very big battlefield preservationist, and he was partly responsible for the formation of the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association, and he actually started the campaign where school kids sent in $1 each that they raised in their classes and preserved land on the battlefield. It was pretty incredible.
Was he on Hee-Haw?
No, he wasn't on Hee-Haw, but he's on the Jack Parr Show, I remember, and then Hollywood Squares, and he always told really, really dirty jokes. Now, it wasn't him. There was another guy that looks kind of like him, like the guy on Petticoat Junction.
Yes, yeah, he looks so familiar.
Oh, I should mention that Charlie Weaver's name is Cliff Arquette, and his grandchildren are David Arquette and Roseanne Arquette. Grandkids. That's his grandkids. Yeah. So, why did he come to Gettysburg? He was really into the battle. And he opened up his own museum in 1959. And his museum is largely filled with miniatures that he himself carved and painted. Wow. Isn't that amazing? And he had a bunch of wax figures in there. If I remember, you walked through wax figures, and they were like friends of his who were Hollywood actors made into Civil War soldiers in wax. And he walked through, and they told you their names. And of course, he had dioramas. There were room after room after room filled with these dioramas of different aspects of the Civil War that had little miniatures in them. And it was, his Fort Sumter was really, really nice. And of course, my favorite thing, and it's still there, but I think the wall's closed off and you have to go on a ghost tour to see it now. But he had this thing in the gift shop where you walk over and you look down in a hole. And of course, the building that he had his museum in was the original Civil War orphanage. And he was the one that told the story about how, first started telling the story about Rosa Carmichael and how she abused the children and would chain them up in the basement. And you went over, and down in the basement, there was a wax figure of a boy chained to the wall. And you pushed a button, and there was an audio tape telling you how he got down there and how he's being abused by Mrs. Carmichael. It was fascinating. I actually have it. I taped the whole thing one day. When I had a camcorder, I taped it because I was just so intrigued. One day it'll be worth money. Nobody will have it but me. So it eventually got changed. Charlie Weaver died. The Tour Center sort of amalgamated it into their collection of museums, and it became the Soldiers National Museum. And you could go there, and you can see it. Now that's closed down. Of course, I took Sam there on the last day of business of the Soldiers National Museum. This is the Pickett's Charge, and the backdrop, the painting as the backdrop, is now in the Union Drummer Boy on York Street on the back wall behind the cash register. If you ever go in there. That's the back. That's the painting was at the back of Charlie Weaver's Pickett's Charge. Now, just want to talk for a moment about the old Gettysburg Village. Did you know there was a Union soldier on top of the building? A building which I think the address is 777. So I think the store there is called 777. Did you ever notice that? But here's the old Gettysburg Village, and that was the tour center did that. That was really interesting. They opened up a bunch of shops in the early '60s for people. That's where the Horse Soldier originally opened up in there. I remember Mrs. Small in the early days. Here is my family. That's me in the red shirt and the really nice looking pants there. I think it's 1974. So there's my family. So I had to throw in, to show you that I've actually been to some of these places. There's an area you walk through and you go around the corner and there's some shops, and they had like a camp set up with wax figures. And they were the 87th Pennsylvania, which later I found out, of course, was a Gettysburg unit. I thought that was really inventive of them to have our Gettysburg unit. But these are all pictures I took in the 70s when I was there. Here we are looking from the hotel property, the Heritage, what's it called now? Inns at Cemetery Ridge, looking back across into the village. And, they always have that. I'd like to go through all the different businesses that were in that center aisle because it changes, again, every year. But I wanted to talk about the Jenny Wade Kitchen. The Jenny Wade Kitchen went through a whole bunch of different names over the years. And we're just talking about it. Let me see if I can get them in order. It was a tavern in the village. It was run by a friend of mine, and that was my place. When I first moved to Gettysburg, I went there all the time. And then they closed down, and I think they became, after that, Brigades. And then it was, for a short time, it was the Gateway, it was called, which is interesting because it's called the Gateway Mini Mart up there now, but it was called the Gateway. And then it was Cracker Jacks. And I was a big fan of Cracker Jacks. I knew the owner. Here's a menu from there. And I was hoping to show it to you, but I couldn't find it. I wrote their placemats with trivia questions on it about the bat when you went to Cracker Jacks. And then after Cracker Jacks, not yet. After Cracker Jacks, it became Spirit Fields. And I think I'm missing one between that. The Pizza Boy restaurant. And then it became Jay's Place. And then it became Subway. And then it became the Hoof, Fin, and Fowl. So that has gone through a number of incarnations. The motel up there was called White's Motel. And White's Hotel, you could get to it from the Baltimore Street side, and it went down and around, and you could also get to it from the Steinward side. But you see that White's Motel. And that's what the motel looked like. When our family came, we stayed there. And here's a postcard of it. And we're on Baltimore Street looking across at it. So this is right beside, the Hoof, Fin, and Fowl would be to the left of this. And then it became the Heritage Motor Lodge, run by the Gettysburg Tour Center. And then here is the portion of the hotel. We're on the Steinway Avenue side looking back up at it. And I think in this next view, you see the white building there is O'Rourke's. To give you an idea what we're talking about. And again, my family stayed here at that place. The Confederate States Armory, run by a guy named Fred Edmonds. And it was a collection of rifles and swords, made or owned or used by Confederate soldiers. And he was a nice guy. The weird thing about Fred Edmonds that I remember is he played in the National Basketball Association, like early on. Maybe it was called the ABA. But he was a basketball player. But you wouldn't know it talking to him in the 80s or 90s. And then we have, of course, the next building down the street, the Dutch Cupboard. Anybody eat at the Dutch Cupboard? Excellent. So, only a couple of us, I'm sure.
Scott.
What's his name?
Sam Scott.
Sam Scott. Now, did the Dayhoffs work there or run it, or just the carriages? Okay. Well, here, if you want to see a bunch of again useless trivia, so here's the Dutch Cupboard, but it was very, very popular. How about this? Throw Papa downstairs his hat. Tell him you're eating at the Dutch Cupboard. So, Pennsylvania Dutch cooking. You love that kind of stuff, right? Look at the very bottom. Famous for schnitz and nepf. Is that how you pronounce that? Schnitz and nepf? And shoe fly pie. Can't have enough Pennsylvania Dutch restaurants. And then here's one, when it's all opened up the front of it. And then they actually closed in the front of it for a while. But then you might notice they opened it back up. And of course today on the right, that's Rita's Ice. So that's where Rita's Ice is. And then of course we have the Holiday Inn, built in 1964. So to give you an idea when that was built. And then beside that, of course, I don't want to talk much about her, but we have the Jenny Wade House Museum, the oldest continuously operational museum in the town. 1901, it opened up as a gift shop. And there, as you can see, I got a brochure from my first visit to Gettysburg. My dad would not shell out the $3 a person to go into the Jenny Wade House Museum. So I was at the Avenue Restaurant. We were eating breakfast or something like that, and I raided the brochure rack. As here's my Jenny Wade brochure from the it's probably like 70s, so 1970, something like that. But did you know that because they were charging money, they had to make sure your visit was worthwhile? So not only did they have the Jenny Wade House Museum, there was a building behind it, which today is where the fitness center is for the 1863 Inn. And in that building, they had like wax displays of people at work, like at the post office, at a country store, at a blacksmith shop. Do you remember this? And you paid money and you went around and you saw these weird wax figures. There was guys playing, see it in the bottom right, there's guys playing checkers.
When did it close?
It might not have been open that long. This might have been a very short-lived thing. There was a snowstorm up there. Remember, the building caved in and they had to do away with the buildings and build something new? At the corner we have the Battlefield Hotel. And again, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago when I did the program, I talked about this. The Battlefield Hotel. It burned in a fire. I think it was in 1960. And the gas station that's there now, it's a mini mart now, but the gas station was put in at that time. And it was Sheets for many years. But right at the corner there of Baltimore and Steinway. Oh, and that brings us to intermission. And you know what that means.
Drawing.
We have our raffle. Andy. Maybe we'll bring those. Okay. So we'll get back to this. I don't want to run you too late in case some of you need to find a way to get home. Good. You're walking.
No, there should be some. Thank you.
Wow. So I wonder when she texted the daughter texted. She said she'd come by. Okay. So now what I thought we'd do is run down the Emmitsburg Road and just talk about a few things that are interesting, and I think everyone will be shocked and surprised by the number of touristy attractions that were on the Emmitsburg Road. No matter what you think, it's going to be more than you have thought. And so be prepared. But first I want to start with one of my favorite restaurants, the Honorable Fujiya.
Fujiya?
The Fujiya. And Gary, that's Gary's way of saying it. Gary Adelman, my co-author of my Devil's Den book, and who I didn't talk about in this program yet. I should talk about him. So Gary and I used to go there. Gary loved it. And all I remember about the place was the first place I ever saw shag carpet. Like, in a restaurant, is that good? All the food trucks on the floor? And then secondly, the Fujiya, and maybe I didn't try the other stuff on their menu. All I remember is that they had a melting pot with cheese. Like, you could buy, like, a big thing of cheese fondue, and you dip stuff in it. Fried things. So, but the Fujiya, of course, now is O'Rourke's. Look at that building, and look how dramatically O'Rourke's changed that building. That front door is the front door. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
Hey, how's that O'Rourke?
that's O'Rourke's.
It looks like an apartment building.
Yeah. The center, they built it up. I think when you went in the front door, you had to go up steps. So they raised the doors. They put a patio up in the air above it. They put stucco on the front of it. And that building actually was built in the 1940s, and it was I'm sure Lauren remembers. It was like the Battlefield Tavern, maybe it was called.
I just remember Battlefield Hotel.
Oh, okay, beside it. But did you eat it, Fujiya?
Oh, yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
It was good. I'll tell you, it was good. So here you go. The Fujiya. One of the first Oriental restaurants in Gettysburg. Did I have to say one of the first? Is there one before that? I don't know. But it was here early on. And then we have, across the street, the Fountain Diner.
Wow.
The Fountain Diner, which, of course, became the Avenue Restaurant. The Avenue Restaurant. I don't know when it changed names, but it was the Avenue Restaurant when I first came here, so I don't know. But roasted chicken.
That's delicious.
And, we have lots of old Avenue Diner stuff. And, the new restaurant there, May's Noodles, is very, very good.
Oh, yeah.
Very good. And Abe Lincoln's place, I was a big fan of Jim Getty. I guess he didn't have the S on it. But he lived across the street up here. And he portrayed Abraham Lincoln. And he had his own little place where he did a performance of Abraham Lincoln. And, of course, what restaurant's that today? Hunt's. It's Hunt's French fries. Yeah. Hunt's Battlefield French fries. I like that. When I'm on a tour and I'm with kids, I'll point to it if I get stuck in traffic. Look, what are Battlefield French fries? It's like boardwalk fries. You're on the boardwalk and you have boardwalk fries. So here you have Battlefield French fries.
Freedom fries.
Yeah, Freedom fries. That Avenue Restaurant's the first I ever saw that when they started Freedom. And Freedom Toast they had too. But that's Hunt's. And then I'm not sure where it was. I can't picture exactly where it was, but one of those buildings along there was this place called Magic Town for a while. Do you remember Magic Town? There was this guy who built replicas of buildings with people in front of them, and they lit up, and they had, you could see inside the rooms, and it was incredible artistry. And then he sold these things. So it was more like a store than a museum. But it was really, really cool. I never saw anybody make dioramas like he did. If I remember correctly, if you go down to the Point, which is the old Prince of Peace Wax Museum at the corner of Emmitsburg Road, Steiner Avenue, and what street is that? Culp Street. That inside there in the lobby, they have one of these buildings, and you can see it's still there on display. So, but this guy was there for a while, probably only a year or two. And that brings us to the Dobbin House. The Dobbin House, before it was a restaurant, was a diorama. And it was the Battlefield Diorama. The first visit we ever came to Gettysburg in the 1960s, I remember it was night, and my dad and I walked down the street. I forget why we were getting a soda or something, and I went into the Battlefield Diorama. So he took me there. And here's an advertisement for the diorama. I have lots of stuff from there. And it was miniatures of the battle in different scenes. Look, 3,600 figures and lights. I often hear from people that there's a guy who lived near Biggerville, and he's still in boxes in his barn, has all this stuff from the diorama. Every once in a while you hear that they're going to get the stuff out and do something with it, but they haven't. But there's brochures for it. I don't have a picture of the diorama itself, but Jackie, who owns the Dobbin House, she has lots of stuff from the diorama. Of course, I always like to point out the gingerbread man. It wasn't always the Eddie's. It was a chain restaurant. Of course, there's a gingerbread man in Carlisle, and it was a very popular restaurant. And right beside it, there was this place called The Conflict, ran by Dick Peterson and his wife, I remember. And I went there when I was a teenager all the time. He had a slide show that he did, where he had like 3 or 4 slide projectors that would flash slides onto a screen, sometimes over top of each other, with music, and it was a dramatic recreation of the battle. And it was very, very, very nice. But it was in that building to the right of the Gingerbread Man or Eddie's. And here's some brochures for his program there. But it was really, really nice. It's like a half an hour long. And of course that brings us down to the Prince of Peace Museum, which we're a town filled with museums. We have a whole president's that's absolutely nothing to do with Gettysburg, right? Unless you want to tie it into Lincoln. The Prince of Peace Museum was a religious wax museum. And it had wax figures of different religious scenes. You remember some of the scenes they had, besides the ones I mentioned?
Oh, well, they probably had about 20, 25 different documents.
Did they have like a crucifixion?
They had it all. Like I told the story of Jesus as you walk through.
Yeah. Now, they had a religious museum in the center of Washington, D.C. for a time, I remember. And I always wondered if maybe that was the same museum moved up, like they bought stuff from them.
No, he made all of it.
He made them all.
Yeah.
But, so for a time, that's why that cross in the front of the building, or where the point is, that's why that goes up like that, because it was part of the design of the museum. And after, here's a brochure from it I have. After that museum, I don't know how many people remember this, it was the Samuel Colt Museum. And they had Colt firearms. And the coolest thing they had was they had a Gatling gun. You know, and I just thought that was really cool. But for me, I think maybe the museum was not enough to make it worth your money. You went in there, and it was one wall, and in the middle of the wall was a Colt firearm. And then there was another wall, and there was another Colt firearm. It just seemed like it cost a lot of money to see some pistols on a wall. And across it from the Colt museum is the Colton Motel. No relation to the Colts. The Colton Motel. And is that still called the Colton Motel? You see? Jeez.
Yeah.
So they haven't changed their name. But I think it's changed owners a bunch of times. And there it is again from the 60s with the National Cemetery in the background. And I don't have some of the, I know I had somewhere in my collection, I have a postcard of the Tasty Freeze that was there, and I have a postcard of, what was the name of there was a hobby shop there, Gilbert's Hobby Shop, was like one of my favorite places ever, was along there. But where the Heritage Motor Lodge is today, or they call that Quality Inn now, it was the Green Gables cottages. And again, these little cottages, log cabins, were prior to motel rooms. And then these things got torn down, and these motel rooms got built. But that's where the Heritage Motor Lodge was originally located. It expanded out from its original building, but there's the original building of it. And that's a Quality Inn today. Now, across the street, where Appalachian Brewery is, or maybe where the beer garden for Appalachian Brewery is, was a restaurant that changed names a bunch of times. Here's Elby's. It was Bob's Big Boy, which I think is just an incarnation of Elby's, right? And then it was the Shoney's. There was another one too. Do you remember the other name there? But
Where's that?
near Appalachian Brewing Company, it's right actually where the beer garden is, where they you sit in the beer garden. It was right there. And then of course we have the Wax Museum, which I really liked. And the Wax Museum is from the 1960s, and there I am on the left. I couldn't tell you what year this is. Yeah, my mom really dressed us nicely. I like my brother's blue jeans. They're blue and pink. What is with that? But that's my family. My dad's not in any of the photographs because he took them. So there we are at the Wax Museum. I remember I got home after my first visit to the Wax Museum, and our whole backyard was set up where I wanted to have a Gettysburg Diorama trail in my backyard. So I was really obsessed. But I got lots of brochures from the Wax Museum, and you can see here they're associated with Elby's, and they show the gift shop, and they also had the tour tapes there you could get for your car and drive around. And here, the displays in the Wax Museum were just fabulous. In the Battle Diorama room, of course.
When did this go out?
The Wax Museum, they changed from a wax museum to the Heritage Center, but still the same kind of conglomerate, like maybe 10 years ago. So they had the wax figures. They had a big sale of all the wax figures, and a lot of people bought the wax figures, and they spent a lot of money on them. I wanted to mention, originally when it opened up, they didn't have any backdrops. It was all curtains in the back, and the wax figure like this of Jenny Wade. They don't do her justice. I got to tell you this story. One day, I was at Cracker Jacks, where I usually hung out up here on top of the hill, and these bikers came in. And it was kind of in the winter, so, they're tough bikers. They're riding bikes. It's in the winter. And they were there at the bar, and we were having a good time, and they said, we want to go someplace and do something really touristy. Where should we go? And I said, well, the Wax Museum's open today, and you can't do anything more touristy or, Gettysburg hokey than that, so you should go there. And so they went there, and like an hour later they came back, and I was still at Cracker Jacks, and they had a Polaroid camera, and they took instant photographs, and they were the only ones there in the Wax Museum, and they climbed in the exhibits with the figures, and they had pictures with the figures, and they took a picture, and boy, I wish I would have gotten it from them, with Jenny Wade. And I'll just leave the story there. You can just let your imagination go. I think you guys should know I do have a bunch of books that I've written on the battle and written on the town, and I don't think that all my books are in print or people know that I wrote books, but I wrote the history of the Wax Museum that they would sell there at the counter explaining the exhibits. One of my books that doesn't sell anymore that's not in print. So the Lincoln Train Museum, interesting. I always, not that I don't like trains, I just had a problem understanding what this was supposed to be. I go in it today, it's still open, it's under new ownership. I still have a problem trying to figure out what it is. So that's where you should take Bo to the Lincoln Train Museum.
I'll let him ride the train.
Yeah, let him ride the train.
Thanks. Yeah.
And the highlight of the Lincoln Train Museum, you still ride the train, but it used to be you were on Lincoln's funeral car riding to Springfield. And the whole front of the car was a movie screen, and it was filmed on the Ma Railroad between Maryland and Hanover. And you're basically bouncing along in an old car, and you're just passing reenactors on the way. Now they have a much more impressive display. I don't know how to describe it, but if you get a chance, it's still there. And there's another image of it. And of course, there's my family. So again, at the Lincoln Train Museum, we're not going to pass up an opportunity to see trains. It's interesting because I know when I visited, and my dad kind of turned around and he said, "What are they doing over here?" And he took this picture of the tower under construction.
Wow.
So it was in the early 70s. So Howard Johnson's. So Howard Johnson's is fascinating because, think about it, we have all these mom and pop motels, and we have, town. We have the Holiday Inn, but all of a sudden we get a Howard Johnson's, and this is the real deal. And here's the complex, shown in one of the brochures. Look at some of the wording here in their descriptions. Whenever business or pleasure brings you to Gettysburg, do as the acknowledgeable motorists do. Acknowledgeable? Have you ever seen that word used like that? I'm quite acknowledgeable. I just don't. I guess that means you agree with everything. I don't know. But here's a great, in the brochures, the conceptual drawing of it. And it ended up being pretty much like that. It's a pretty big complex. And they had a bar. And I think on, I'm from Maryland, and when I was 18, I was allowed to drink. Maryland had drinking at 18 for a while. And so, when I was younger, I'd come to Gettysburg and nobody carded you, and my friends took me to the commander's room. Is that what they called it?
Yeah, rum cake.
And this is where I heard my first stories by locals about the town. Like, for instance, everyone there told you that Mamie Eisenhower was a regular there. And, the locals, I guess, had a lot of stories about Mamie's drinking habits after Ike had died when she came out with the Secret Service. But I remember that there. Now, here's her brochure, one of their early brochures, and it has normal things that a brochure would have on it. But look at the top of it up there, in the top middle. What is that on the brochure?
There you go.
Sex sells.
Is that a special kind of shower that, it's a steam bath or something?
That'll be a long time.
And then, of course, the restaurant at Howard Johnson's, which was very, very good. Howard Johnson's has a really nice chain of restaurants. And, of course, today that's the Friendly's. And I think Friendly's, when they first opened up, I got this brochure from them because I thought this was genius. Don't you think? I think right now in our town, I think the best use of symbolism in town is the Fourscore Brewery, where they have Abraham Lincoln's hat on top of some hops.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay. And then here's another view of the signs. Remember, the National Park Service Museum, or actually, at this point, in this photograph, it was privately owned by the Rosensteels, is off to the right. But you see some things along there like the Dutch Beef House, which is near, I forget exactly what building it's in, but then you see the Heritage Motor Lodge and down the way.
Yeah. Wait, is that at the entrance of the...
Yeah, it's near the entrance to the
park?
The park, the visitor center, not the Secularrama entrance, but the one before that's got torn out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a gas station right there, I remember, and I remember they rented, in the 70s and early 80s, they rented mopeds. I thought that was cool. I should have done that, didn't do that. Across the street we have, of course, General Pickett's all-you-can-eat Battlefield Buffet.
Ooh.
Or what originally was known as the Gettysburg Battle Theater Cafeteria. And early on, I don't remember what it was. I remember, maybe we're talking about 79. I sometimes was given charge of my little brother, Dan. And so I would say, okay, give me the car, I'll babysit him, and we come to Gettysburg. And I'd make him tromp the battlefield. I took him to the Battlefield Cafeteria, and look on the top left. Now maybe Kayla's grandmom is in this photograph as a younger lady.
Probably not.
But she worked there for many years. And they literally, it was a cafeteria. You put a tray on a line and you slid it down, and a lady in a hairnet threw mashed potatoes with an ice cream scooper on your plate. And I don't know why this was like a place you'd want to go. I just didn't get the whole concept of it. But they catered bus groups, and a lot of bus groups. And upstairs they had this film, and then it later got changed into a slideshow. And I thought their slideshow was really interesting. Again, they used slide carousels, a bunch of them, and they threw images up on the screen on top of each other. And they've replaced it now, and as far as I know, they still have a movie they show upstairs. Has anybody else seen it? The facts are really bad.
What is
Really
the place
bad.
still?
It's called General Pickett's all-you-can-eat Battlefield Buffet.
Oh, it's still?
Yeah. But at that time it was called the cafeteria, the Battle Cafeteria.
Okay.
So I always thought there was nothing in the Battle Theater.
Yeah.
I didn't
There's a
know it was
movie.
still open.
Yeah. The last time I was there, it was still open. So, yeah, maybe it's by request. By request and only for a group. Okay. So now let's go down the Emmitsburg Road. And of course, the first motel we come to is the Home Sweet Home. I knew the owner of the Home Sweet Home, Bob Fair. Duffy, we called him. He died many years ago. He rented for his aunt. And his aunt's family had opened it up in the 1920s, he told me. And look at it here in the 1940s. It is cottages. You see that? The cottages? And then the cottages were turned into the motel at some point. You see how that works in this industry? And then eventually the park purchased it, but for many years it was there, and it was cheap housing for people who lived out of town that wanted to come and spend the weekend here. A lot of the battlefield guys lived there. Now, if you look on the top right of this, you see where it says Home Sweet Home Motel? And right below it, along the long lane there, and along the Emmitsburg Road is the prisoner of war camp in World War II. Do you know not only did the federal government use the Field of Pickett's Charge in World War I for a recruitment camp, some 25,000 soldiers passed through that camp, but they also, at the 1913 reunion, had tents there and things set up. And in World War II, it was a German POW camp. 500 prisoners at its height. Can you imagine? Prisoners in a fenced-in camp guarded in the fields of Pickett's Charge. On July 5th, 1944, 2 German prisoners snuck out, went through a culvert underneath the fence in the road, and made it up by escaping into the crowd on Cemetery Ridge.
They catch him?
They caught him a few days later in New York, but yes. Now, here's how bad it became on the Emmitsburg Road. In the next few slides, if you don't know anything about this is going to stun you. There on the right is the monument to the 1st Massachusetts Infantry. And right beside it, we have a billboard for Stuckey's Restaurant. There was private and public property mixed together, and whenever there was private property, we needed a sign to advertise that there's a Stuckey's coming up, and they have good milkshakes. There was a hotel on the battlefield. What are we going to call the hotel?
Wow. Battlefield Hotel.
This hotel was just to the north of the Sherfy House, and on the right side of the road as you go out to Emmitsburg Road. The Battlefield Motel. And it was there for many years. And, I went to a lecture one time by Kathy George, a historian of the National Park, and I think I appreciated for the first time some of the work that the National Park Service did in the 1960s and 70s by purchasing some of these motels that were in the middle of the fields of Pickett's Charge and the Second Day's Battlefield. But this one was right there, right on the Emmitsburg Road. And here you get a good view of it. And we're looking down from near the Klingel farm. And if you look in the distance there, above the motel, that white building, that's the Sherfy House. And the Sherfy House itself was used as a tourist home by the Folkenroths. Folkenroth? I don't know.
Not a bed and breakfast.
It is a bed and breakfast. No, does it say breakfast? No, they don't have breakfast. But it's interesting. I like the dog in the front yard.
Looks like he's taking it down. Looks a lot different.
Do you notice on the side of the house is a cherry tree with a cannonball on it, and it's in a canopy? So that was there. That thing wasn't removed until like the 1930s or 40s. That cannonball. And here is looking the other way. We're at the peach orchard, and we're looking down towards the Sherfy farm. Look at those billboards in the 60s. Fantasyland. I should have blew them up to read the other ones. So, one of the things is that, the billboards were everywhere at one point. And then, of course, that brings us to Stuckey's Restaurant. There's a great story told by Eisenhower. Eisenhower became really interested in battlefield preservation. And he met a few times with the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association late in his life, and he was one of the proponents to lead the charge to get Stuckey's removed from the peach orchard. And Mamie was really upset because she loved their pecan pie. But yes, there was a Stuckey's at the peach orchard, right in the middle of the battlefield. See, and here's what I like about this. The Battlefield Motel, look, in the heart of the historic Gettysburg battlefield. These kind of statements were almost a challenge to preservationists at that time. Oh yeah? Look, we're built right in the middle of the battlefield. And they're not saying they're not. Look, on the left, you see the monument to, right there, what is that, the 63rd Pennsylvania monument? Right there on the corner? I mean, sometimes some of this stuff horrifies us today, but the whole Emmitsburg Road was developed. And I could do a whole show on the Stuckies.
That must have altered terrain quite a bit.
Well, when they moved it, yeah, I think you go out there today and you see it and you think it's always been like that. Now, just beyond the Stuckies, just beyond the Wheatfield Road, on the right-hand side was the Lee Mead Inn. And this was a huge complex. And they also had cabins. See the cabins there.
Well, Jim, World War II, is there any truth to the story that the military stayed in that hotel and planned an invasion of Japan?
Well, I don't know if they planned the invasion, but there were military personnel that were sent to Gettysburg, and they stayed in that hotel during World War II, and they interrogated Japanese prisoners of war about the defenses, in the South Pacific. So, if you were to stretch it and say this is the one place where they planned an invasion, well, but there is some truth to that. Yes. Here's the Lee Mead Inn from the tower. We're on top of the Confederate Tower, and we're looking across towards Bigelow Round Top to give you an idea how expensive this is. And then we come to Pinchgut. Almost done. We're going down Emmitsburg Road. Pinchgut. So Pinchgut was called that because of the South and West Confederate Avenue across the Emmitsburg Road. It's such an angle, it pinches off a piece of land there. When I was a kid, one of the locals, John Horner, who recently died, told me that area is called Pinchgut because the Georgia soldiers attacking Little Round Top hadn't eaten in days. So they wouldn't get hungry, they pinched their guts. It's like, okay. But there were lots of restaurants. Here's the Ecken Road restaurant that sat on the corner of Pinchgut for many years. Eberhart's restaurant there. Yeah, right there. And then right on the other side of it, just south of Pinchgut, is this restaurant that was called for a time the Round Top Inn. And then here's a view of the Round Top Inn looking north. And you can see the Round Top Inn, and then beyond it is the Eberhart's. And I got to show you this card. This is prior to the Round Top Inn. And I'm a little, upset by the name or taken aback. I don't know what they were thinking.
Pennsylvania Dutch.
And speaking of the Pennsylvania Dutch, here's a building, and I don't remember it as Scheids Carolina Motel, but they had buildings behind it, like little buildings. But this is also, I don't know if you can read the sign, it's the Pennsylvania Dutch Gift Shop. You got to have Pennsylvania Dutch gifts. That was big. They were big in the area. And just don't have as many Pennsylvania Dutch gift shops. But the park bought this and tore it down. We are now at the South End Guide Station where the bathrooms are. And behind that is the Eisenhower Farm. And when Eisenhower first visited Gettysburg, he actually, when he was planning to, I shouldn't say first visited, because he was here in 1913 at Camp Cole. I'm sorry, 1915? No, that would be 1918 is Camp Cole. But when Eisenhower was here in 1950, when he looked at the farm he would eventually purchase, he came to the Rose Garden Tea Room and he ate lunch. There's an article in the paper about how people see him there. And of course he's famous because he's the Supreme Allied Commander before he's president. But they have cottages. And that was a big attraction down there. And this is directly across the street, again, from the like the tour center, I should say the South End Guide Station. And look, in the distance you can see the tower on Confederate Avenue in this postcard. But the Rose Garden Tea Room and Hotel. And we have, again, another view of it. Wouldn't you like to stay in one of those cabins?
Yeah.
Do you think they have bathrooms, or is there common bathrooms somewhere else you have to share?
Sure.
Probably not now.
Now, the last part of the program here, only a couple minutes, I just wanted to mention that there's lots of tours, ways to tour the battlefield. And, sometimes I think it's hard for us to decide, how you should tour the battlefield and how you should not tour the battlefield. And who am I to be critical as to how people want to experience the battlefield? But it always amazes me when I'm out there to see the different people experiencing in different ways. Like, here are people on a ghost tour. Of course, we have the licensed battlefield guides, and being a guide, I like to laugh at myself and the other guides. And some of us guides take it way too seriously because we're, licensed and trained and tested. Like oftentimes I said on your show, Matt, you don't have to take a test to be a park ranger. That's kind of neat. Here's one of my tour guide friends, Jim Tate. He was a tour guide for 65 years. I don't think I'm going to make it that long. You can take a tour on a bus. And most of these buses, like we talked about, have audio tours where you listen to a tour tape. And I've done that. And the buses really haven't changed that much. Do you remember history nerds? Of course, bus companies don't last that long. And, here's the history nerd van, the newer van you got on a little round top. And, Tim Daniel used to come here all the time, sitting right here at the bar. And his company had a sudden ending. Yeah. And, he had some business problems because of that accident. Just like do you remember this company? West Air, I think his name was. He had the same kind of problems with running a tour company in Gettysburg and abiding by all the regulations and rules. The tour tapes are always interesting to me. Do you know in the 60s you could get a cassette tape and go around the battlefield? It became very popular in the 70s and 80s. I have a massive collection of all the different tour tapes that you could use in the town over the years.
Were those for purchase, or was they just...
You could purchase them, yes. Okay. But the first time I used them, you went to the Secularrama Center, and they rented you the tape recorder. And you actually had a physical tape recorder. At the bottom, she's got one, in your car.
Wow.
And they gave it to you. It was a big, bulky thing.
Yeah.
And you had to give a deposit, and I think it cost $4. And you rented the tape. And then you brought it back at the end after you took the tour of the battlefield. My favorite tour tape of the battlefield of all time, The Final Fury. Bruce Catton wrote it, narrated by Walter Cronkite. And I still have that. It was very, very good. And then, did you know you could take a train ride on the battlefield? When I did it, when my son, I think he was like 2, it was near the end of the train company going out of business. There was a tour guide to talk to you while you were on the train. Not a licensed guide, though. I couldn't tell you the mistakes that I was stunned by the mistakes he was making. Like he pointed at the Doubleday Inn and called it the Carrie Sheed's house. And claimed to be related to Carrie Sheeds. He showed us a spot in the woods near the Peace Light where they buried 500 horses. So speaking of horses, there's horse tours of the battlefield. Now, here's my question about these, and these are questions I have all the time on the park. Are these people here to tour the battlefield or to ride a horse? We pick on people for having picnics on the battlefield and throwing frisbees. What's the difference? These people aren't touring the battlefield, they're riding a horse. I was going to tell you that one of the horse people said to me the other day, or not the other day, but said to me that I can't understand cavalry because I don't know how to ride a horse. Like riding a horse would enlighten me more about the giant butter knives.
I agree.
So look at this, the scoot coops. Really? Are they touring the battlefield, or are they just riding in a giant bumper car?
They're terribly loud.
And then, of course, this harkens back to something that I remember when I was young, the helicopter tour. Do you know there was a tour where you paid money and you went up in a helicopter and you rode around the battlefield? This was very successful for a short time. The helicopters got incredibly close to Little Round Top. Can you imagine standing on Little Round Top and a helicopter and making all this noise comes by the front of the hill? So they made a rule, and I'm not sure exactly when it was made, but they made a rule that you have to be 500 feet above the battlefield. You can't, fly down in front of Little Round Top. But they were doing it on these helicopter tours. And blimps did it. I was on a tour one day in I think it was 2000. And I turned around and the Monster.com blimp went right across the front of Little Round Top. If you remember Monster.com.
Yeah.
So here, look at this top photograph. See? Look how, and they're just doing this for the photograph, but they're flying right near Little Round Top. Do you think that's appropriate? Sure. Now, the guy that owned this company, Mr. Voss, was a very nice guy, and his main line of business was called ag rotors. And he developed helicopters that would spread fertilizer and pesticides on orchards and fields in Adams County, and that's how he made his money. This helicopter tour was just a thing he did on the side for a while. But I knew him. I got some stuff from him. But it just amazes me, the whole concept. And I saw him. I remember being out on the battlefield there. But I got to tell you one last thing. This is serious. There used to be an airplane tour of the battlefield. And we're talking about starting in 1927. The airfield was the 40 field near Iverson's Pits. And here they had, female pilots. And again, the tower is in the background, the Oak Ridge Tower. And see, it's called the Gettysburg Flying Service. And you got in the plane and you took a tour of the battlefield. Look at that, 1927, $3. Have you thought about things like this, how you tour the battlefield? And here's their brochure, and look, they have a map of the circle they take. You see, they take off, and they fly up and then down Confederate Avenue and around. It looks like they can make a few loops, but look at that. And then, according to this part of it, if you take the tour and you're successful in your adventure, then at the end, you see, they give you a certificate. $3. Do you think in 1927 to 1940 is when it stopped? Doesn't that seem like a lot of money?
Yeah.
Technology.
What year did they stop?
I think 1940.
Oh.
Yeah. And then here, you see, once I found out that they gave out cards, I was like, I wonder if we have it in our collection. And I searched the Historical Society collection, and sure enough, we have 2 of them. We have 2 certificates of completion. Now, Lauren, did you ever think about going on the airplane ride? You would have been like 5.
Could get me on a helicopter.
Did you know Mr. Voss?
Yeah, I did.
He was a good guy.
You know, Tim, there was a A&W root beer on Route 15 near Stuckey's. That was there for years.
Oh, no,
Yeah, you don't have a picture, but
No.
anyway, it was A&W root beer.
So I think that's my last. And then, of course, you know what? I don't know where I'm going from here. I put Fantasyland in. So we have Fantasyland. Do you know there's always been things around Gettysburg that were attractions that weren't created for Civil War buffs. And I think I'm comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with that fact. So we have Fantasyland. And Fantasyland is very popular. How about miniature golf? We have lots of miniature golf around the town, like the Why Not or Mulligan McDuffers or the one out around 30. And, it's something for families to do while they're touring the battlefield. Who would have thought that they would build a 300-foot tower and charge people to go on the money of it and call it the classroom in the sky? Okay, I'm done.
Slid us a little more easier in
So there.
When was that tower first? When was it built?
Yeah, it was built in the 70s, and it took a long time, and I think it opened for business in the summer of 1974, off the top of my head.
It went down in 90?
2000, I think it was 2000. I don't know when it went out of business, but you know what happened was interesting, that by the end, the owners wanted to sell it. They were looking at a huge expense in repairs. It had been there for 30 years. It was not doing very well. I remember there was a time when they had to spend $80,000 to put new bolts in the tower, and it was constantly because of the wind coming loose, and they had to repair it. And the expense of the elevator was crazy. So the guy who owned it had a group of investors, and they wanted the park to buy it, and the park didn't want to buy it. So they started playing really loud country music, the most annoying form of music to ever exist. I'm just kidding. They played loud country music, literally, from the top of the tower, and had giant speakers pointed at the park visitor center.
I thought it was rap.
Oh, the most annoying? You could be right. So it was really interesting. And at the end, they started their own campaign. Hey, we should tear the tower down because it's a tourist annoyance, and it's a scar, a blight on the landscape. And people fell for it, and we ended up buying it from them and tearing it down. But they're the ones who wanted us to buy and tear it down because they needed to make money. And in the end, the guy who's in this photograph on the left, Ottenstein, from Silver Springs, Maryland, he died before he got any money from the tower. So he died just before they made the final the payment. But it's fascinating. The tower's fascinating as an icon in our town.
Where exactly was it at?
It's right now. I guess the best way to see where it was at is go to Evergreen Cemetery, and at the very bottom of the cemetery, just on the other side of the fence. From the Baltimore Pike, it was directly behind the Pike Restaurant. Or you can go into the site from the Tawnytown Road, go by the park law enforcement office, and their lane that leads down to it's still there. You can still go to the site and see, find pieces of the tower laying around.
Well, didn't they, how did they construct it? Did they break it all down?
They imploded it, yeah.
That's what I
And
thought.
you can watch, if you get online and look, Gettysburg National Tower implosion, they have the videos online. There's a little documentary about it coming down, and it was fascinating. And I was there that day in the Evergreen Cemetery.
Yeah, I was up by the Secularrama Building.
Yeah.
There was a group of people there. We were staying at the Quality Inn, and we saw everybody up there. I'm like, what's going on?
Oh.
So we walked over, and literally, when I was about to say, hey, what's going on here, I heard boom, 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 and the thing starts to buckle.
It was awesome.
It was pretty cool, but...
So thanks for coming to the program, and if you need to, run out, pay your bill and run out, or you can. I think the football game's over. Okay, well, thanks everybody.